Welcome to This Explainer. Look, if you've ever stood at the front of your classroom and wondered why certain students seem completely disconnected, chronically disruptive, or just deeply frustrated despite your absolute best efforts, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're going to translate some of those complex clinical definitions of developmental and cognitive disorders into a practical, empathetic guide. Because as educators, our goal is to recognize, understand, and effectively teach students who are navigating some pretty complex neurodevelopmental challenges. Together, we're going to bridge that gap between clinical psychology and your classroom.
Here is our lesson plan for today's explainer. 1. ADHD in the classroom. 2. Decoding ADHD etiology and treatment. 3. Navigating conduct disorder. 4. Identifying specific learning disorders. And 5. Understanding communication disorders. We're really anchoring on one core theme today. Understanding the brain helps us teach the child. When we grasp the why behind a behavior, we can completely transform the how of our instruction. Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, ADHD in the classroom, beyond distraction. So clinically speaking, attention deficit/hyperactivity disorder is a persistent pattern of inattention and/or hyperactivity impulsivity that actively interferes with a child's daily functioning. And notice the timeline here. These symptoms have to be present before age 12. But the absolutely crucial point for us as teachers is that phrase, 2 or more settings. This means a student's struggle to stay seated or focus isn't just a reaction to your specific classroom environment. It's happening at school, sure, but it's also happening at home and during extracurriculars. It's a pervasive 24/7 neurodevelopmental reality for them. Now, ADHD actually shows up in 2 very distinct ways in the classroom. On one side, you've got the inattentive presentation. Think of the student who silently avoids sustained mental effort, who is disorganized and constantly losing things. They honestly often fly under the radar because, well, they aren't actively disrupting the class. On the flip side is the hyperactive impulsive presentation. This is the student who fidgets, gets out of their seat, and literally cannot stop blurting out answers or waiting their turn. And yeah, a student can absolutely have a combined presentation, dealing with both of these symptom clusters at the same time. Recognizing these distinct profiles is really step 1 to effectively reaching them. Moving right along to Section 2, Decoding ADHD etiology and treatment, the why and how. To truly support these kids, we have to decode the root causes. Biologically, ADHD is highly heritable. It's linked to an underactivation of the frontostriatal circuits in the brain and dopamine dysregulation, which directly impacts their executive function. Psychologically, this manifests as major deficits in behavioral inhibition and working memory. When you realize that ADHD is rooted in actual structural brain differences and dopamine dysregulation, it really proves these students aren't just acting out to give you a hard time. And while social factors like family environment can totally influence how the symptoms are expressed, they aren't the core cause. Understanding this biological reality changes everything about how we approach teaching them.
So what do we actually do about it? Well, the clinical data points to a very clear path. Stimulant medications are highly effective for managing those core symptoms. However, combining those meds with dedicated classroom behavioral interventions almost always outperforms either method on its own. This is where you come in. Your behavioral interventions in the classroom aren't just nice little extras. They are a scientifically validated component of optimal support. You're helping the student function successfully in the real world.
Let's turn to Section 3, Navigating Conduct Disorder, Understanding Rule Violations. Conduct disorder is defined as a repetitive, persistent pattern of behavior that actively violates the basic rights of others or major age-appropriate societal norms. We are definitely not talking about standard childhood rebellion or testing boundaries here. We're talking about serious symptom categories: aggression to people or animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness, and severe rule violations like truancy, specifically occurring before age 13. Just like with ADHD, understanding the root causes here completely changes how we respond. A crucial psychological factor to know is hostile attribution bias. This is a huge one for educators to understand. It means the student might react aggressively because their brain falsely interprets perfectly ambiguous situations as highly threatening. Think about it. If you bump into their desk, totally by accident, mind you, their brain might process it as an intentional hostile attack. Combine that bias with biological temperaments of low fear and high reward sensitivity, plus social factors like harsh discipline or community violence, and you've got a perfect storm for severe behavioral disruptions. We also really need to watch out for high-risk specifiers. It's vital to note that childhood onset, meaning these symptoms show up before age 10, is associated with a much worse long-term prognosis. Also, the presence of callous, unemotional traits, things like a distinct lack of empathy, zero remorse or guilt, and shallow affect. These are the students who genuinely seem completely unconcerned about their poor academic performance or the negative impact their actions have on their classmates. Facing these kinds of severe behavioral, biological, and psychological challenges in the classroom can feel incredibly overwhelming, right? But the narrative simply has to pivot from how do we discipline this out of them to how do we actually support these students? Because let's be honest, traditional punishment simply does not rewire a hostile attribution bias. The most effective actionable payoff for educators and school systems here is multi-systemic therapy. The evidence strongly shows that treating conduct disorder in isolation just doesn't work. By intervening collaboratively across the school, family, and peer systems, we can substantially improve a child's prognosis. Parent management training is also highly effective, but early intervention is the absolute key here. As educators, you're often the very first line of defense in spotting these patterns early enough to trigger this kind of wraparound support.
All right, Section 4, Identifying Specific Learning Disorders, the Classroom Struggle. You've definitely encountered these terms before, but let's quickly anchor them. Specific learning disorders mean a student is performing well below expectations for their age, schooling, and intelligence in very exact areas. So we have dyslexia, which is a significant and persistent difficulty in reading, dysgraphia, representing significant difficulty in written expression, and dyscalculia, a significant difficulty in mathematics. This is why you might have a student who is brilliantly articulate in a class discussion, but completely shuts down the second you ask them to write a single paragraph. And this brings us to what might be the most crucial takeaway of this entire explainer. Hear me out on this one. These struggles are neurodevelopmental. They are rooted in genetic and neurological differences in brain networks. This means a learning disorder is not a sign of a bad kid. It is not laziness. And importantly for you to hear, it is not a failure of your basic instruction. Understanding this completely removes the blame from both the student and you, the teacher, which frees us up to pivot to the specialized strategies we actually need to teach them effectively. And finally, Section 5, Understanding Communication Disorders Beyond Words. These 4 distinct categories show exactly where a student's communication might be breaking down. A language disorder involves deficits in vocabulary or sentence structure. A speech sound disorder means their actual physical speech production makes it hard for them to be understood. Fluency disorder is what we commonly know as stuttering. But pay really close attention to that last one, social or pragmatic communication disorder. This is a persistent difficulty with the social use of communication, like understanding the unspoken rules of a conversation or using language appropriately for the context, but crucially without displaying the repetitive behaviors we associate with autism. It is a subtle but massive barrier to learning and making friends. Now, unlike ADHD, where medication plays a huge role, that is not the answer here. The path forward for learning and communication disorders relies entirely on specialized educational and speech-language interventions, which makes your role and your collaboration with speech-language pathologists absolutely critical. You are quite literally the delivery system for the treatment they need to succeed. We've covered a ton of clinical ground today, from the dopamine dysregulation of ADHD to the hostile attribution bias in conduct disorder, right through to the neurological roots of learning challenges. So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. How will understanding these neurodevelopmental differences change your approach to teaching tomorrow? Because when we shift our perspective from merely managing bad behavior to actively supporting differently wired brains, we don't just change our classrooms, we literally change these students' lives. Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and seriously, keep up the amazing work you do out there every single day.